You're listening to the Diplomats Asia Geopolitics podcast. I'm your host, Katie Putz, coming to you from Washington, D.C.
And this is Ankit Panda, your co-host, recording also in Washington, D.C.
How are you doing, Ankit?
Good, Katie. Good to be back. We've got a lot to continue our discussion from last episode on.
Yes, we do. We are in the midst of our sort of top 8 geopolitical flashpoints, hot spots, hot topics from 2023. And just to remind you, if you didn't listen to the first episode, you should go back and listen to that one. But this is not a ranked list. These are just a list that Ankit and I compiled, sort of shooting ideas back and forth. And so I'm going to kick us off with number 5 on our list, which is Central Asia's renewed centralness. You know, as the resident Central Asia voice on this podcast, I had to pick something in Central Asia, but it was very easy this year. You know, 2023 has undoubtedly been one of the busiest years diplomatically for the Central Asian states. You know, the 5 Central Asian leaders met with China's Xi Jinping in May in Xi'an. They met with EU President Charles Michel in June in Chulpanata, which is in Kyrgyzstan. They met with U.S. President Joe Biden in September on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, which actually was the first time a U.S. president has ever met with all 5 Central Asian leaders at once. So it was a pretty momentous occasion. And then right after that, all 5 Central Asian presidents flew off to Germany to meet with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And that's just the sort of leader level meetings. There have been dozens of ministerial and lower level trips, both in Central Asia and then around the world. And, I think there are several drivers of this. You know, the war in Ukraine is an obvious one, certainly driving European and U.S. interest in Central Asia for a variety of sort of subsequent reasons, from energy to sanctions enforcement. Chinese interest in Central Asia, has been building over the past decade. In 2023, we marked the 10-year anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, and sort of China is looking towards the future and its future sort of rhetorical tools to sort of talk about how it wants to sort of orchestrate its own policies and its engagement with the world. And then I think sort of the third sort of thing that I like to mention with this is, the end of the war in Afghanistan in 2021 is also, I think, a factor that kind of freed up at least mental space for Western diplomats to think more broadly about Central Asia. And so I think we're seeing some of that now. Afghanistan remains an important issue. It certainly is to the Central Asian states, but it no longer drives the engagement with the region, which had been the case for the last 20 years. I teased Ankit, told him I would ask him about Central Asia. So everybody get ready for the dodge.
Well, I won't dodge entirely, because I think what I will say about this, and when we talked about this on the podcast a few months ago, I was a lot fresher on this. Actually, having had my my cab ride in Berlin interrupted by Kazakh President Tokayev's motorcade, I was certainly interested in these broader trends. I think what I would say about this, though, Katie, is that I remember we talked about Central Asia pretty quickly after February 24th, 2022, after the Ukraine war began, and the implications of the war on this region more broadly and its constituent states. And I think this is exactly the kind of behavior that we should have expected to see. And you're absolutely right that with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, both to the north and to the south, Central Asia, I think, has seen a significant change in its regional geopolitical context that I think incentivizes this kind of outreach, right? And I think it's also positive that Central Asian states, I think, are looking to engage with the United States and the West and China. I mean, really on their own initiative and independence here. I mean, for what the region can offer holistically, not just in relation to Russia or in relation to supporting stability in Afghanistan. So I think that's quite interesting and striking. And certainly, I think, I would broadly expect that to continue into the next year. But am I right about that? Do you see any risks derailing this broader trend line?
I don't necessarily see risks of this trend being derailed, but 2024 will just not be as busy a year. There's a couple of unknowns. I don't think that China plans to meet annually with the 5 Central Asian leaders. I believe they're going to do that every other year, so there won't be a China Central Asia summit. It's unclear, or at least nobody has told me yet, that the U.S. plans to have a C5+1 leaders meeting every year. I expect the foreign ministers level meeting to continue and for them to go hard on that. But I just don't see Biden meeting with, the five Central Asian presidents in September, right before the U.S. elections, meeting with these five essentially autocratic dictators. I don't see that happening, and so we can revisit that if it happens in September. But I think the pace of those diplomatic engagements will necessarily slow a little bit, and it moves into the phase of operationalizing the things that have been agreed to. So take the U.S. Central Asia dynamic in the joint statement that came out of the meeting in September. One of the things that was mentioned is a critical minerals group. And so seeing if that actually starts working, and what kind of engagements tactically start happening, as opposed to just sort of statements. High level meetings are great, and joint statements are wonderful to analyze, but what happens after those, I think, is the thing of more importance. So I think we'll see in 2024 how useful those meetings have been. Even if we don't see that same high level of engagement, we'll actually see activity below that will be worth watching.
Absolutely. Well, let's continue our list here, hopping again regionally, this time over to Oceania, where we'll reflect a little bit on Australia. And Australia in itself obviously doesn't tell us much about what we're talking about here, but really it's about, first of all, in March 2023, we had the finalization of the AUKUS partnership's practical consultative period on how exactly the AUKUS program would proceed, particularly on the Pillar 1 issue, which is the nuclear-powered submarine, right? AUKUS has two pillars, the second pillar being the broader set of defense industrial cooperation, investment in long-range missiles, et cetera, et cetera. And to this, Katie, I'd actually also add Australia's mid-year defense strategic review, which is interesting because it follows up and builds on the 2020 Defense Strategic Update, which revised the 2016 Defense White Paper. And over these three documents, I think you really see a story being told about how Australia sees its own national defense requirements and the probability of high-intensity interstate conflict. Whereas in 2016, that wasn't a big concern. Declining ties with China, growing concerns about Chinese behavior in the region, and the possibility of a conflict over the Taiwan Strait in particular, I think have led Australia to this new broad approach to its defense strategy. And the defense review is very interesting. Australia moving away from land-based forces to more expeditionary power projection capabilities with long-range missiles, supplementing some of the anticipated capabilities that'll be implemented through AUKUS. But I think it might just be useful to just go over the plan, right? The AUKUS plan, because I think some of the listeners might not recall, because we did talk about this several episodes ago at the start of the year. So the broader plan is that beginning basically now, Australian military and civilian personnel will start to embed with the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy to better understand the operation of nuclear submarines. And going into next year, this will also include training and development exercises, and UK submarine visits to Australia will also probably kick off by 2025 or 2026. And then by 2027, the U.S. and the U.K. will plan to initiate forward rotations of their nuclear-armed attack submarines, nuclear-propelled attack submarines to Australia, and further promote the development of Australia's own indigenous expertise. And then in 2030s, this is the real kind of sticking point for the United States, is the U.S. will sell Australia 3 Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, and potentially 2 more if necessary. This has raised a lot of concerns about just the U.S. submarine industrial base and whether making good on this AUKUS requirement will leave the U.S. fleet where it needs to be. And then finally, by the late 2030s, the plan is to deliver what will be known as SSN AUKUS. That is the special Australia-specific nuclear-powered conventionally armed submarine that the UK, in coordination with Australia, will develop and deliver, potentially by the early 2040s, practically. So that's a little overview of the AUKUS plan. But Katie, when you look at Australia and you look back on the year, what are your big takeaways?
I mean, certainly on the geopolitical angle, AUKUS is the top line story there. I think maybe one thing worth mentioning to listeners is that the provision of those the three nuclear powered Virginia class submarines, selling those to Australia, that was subject to congressional approval, which finally happened in mid-December when the NDAA was passed. But there was a period where it wasn't clear if that would be passed, and so I think that the sort of first hurdle was cleared. But as you pointed out, it's going to be a long journey, and so I think certainly what happens in the U.S. election and what happens in the U.S. economy, and in the U.S. sort of submarine fleet's capabilities certainly will impact this process. And in Australia, it's also subject to its own domestic debate and questions both about the nuclear angle of this, and then the just the burden of taking on these submarines and what that entails. And so I think those are certainly things to watch. And then just sort of as a bonus on the domestic angle in Australia, there was a vote in October whether to include an Indigenous voice in the parliament, and that failed pretty miserably amid a pretty nasty campaign. And so I just wanted to mention that, because I think we sometimes overlook Australia's internal domestic politics, and so it has sort of I think an influence on the wider position of Australia in the Pacific in particular, because as Australia is trying to sort of rebuild these relationships with Pacific Island countries, there's a lot of questions about both Indigenous issues and respect for the region and that kind of thing. And then one other thing I wanted to mention this angle is, at the same time that we sort of have this rapprochement between the U.S. and China, we saw a similar smoothing out of relations between China and Australia. Australian Prime Minister Albanese traveled to China and met with Xi Jinping this fall. And so I think there is a stabilization in that relationship, and that is something that we'll have to keep an eye on as the year goes on, and certainly as the AUKUS program progresses, because even if you don't write China on the submarines, China thinks that those submarines are for it. So I think they will be watching very closely.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that Australia will be on our list next year, because I think this was an interesting year with the review and the update and some of the domestic political turns and the geopolitical turn with China. So I think a lot of the next few years for Australia, I think, really will be will be kind of evaluating how well all of this is going to be implemented. I think the big concern a lot of folks have with AUKUS is AUKUS going to be derailed potentially by political changes in the United States, by just the tendency of large, ambitious defense undertakings to be bogged down by budget overruns and other logistical difficulties. So it will be, I think, a lot of kind of the rubber hitting the road on a lot of these plans over the next few years. But we'll certainly be looking at that more broadly at the Diplomat. So we're almost at we're on the final two items on our list of 8 that we began with the last episode. For listeners keeping track of numbers, we're on number 7 now. Again, not in order, but this one I think is a really interesting one, and certainly I think one that's been welcomed here in Washington, which is growing trilateral cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Right? I mean, this was really, I think, gave some folks whiplash if you just think back to where Japan-South Korea ties were just 18 months ago, before President Yoon was inaugurated in South Korea. They were in a very bad place, right? I mean, just in a way that was unimaginable that we would see the Camp David summit in the United States with the 3 leaders meeting. And then, Katie, we're recording this in late December 2023, and just a few days ago, the U.S., Japan, and South Korea activated a new trilateral missile warning data sharing mechanism that fuses Japanese and South Korean radars with sort of U.S. assistance, kind of a very concrete demonstration of the benefits of trilateral cooperation. So I think there's a lot to talk about here, but why don't we sort of kick off with your impressions of the politics of this? Because I'm going to pull you out a little bit more on domestic politics, given what you just had to say about Australia. But I think domestic politics, I think, were obviously the big concern about the sustainability of trilateral cooperation, particularly South Korean domestic politics, and actually Japanese domestic politics, including intra-Liberal Democratic Party LDP dynamics. So what are your observations on the domestic political components of this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there was some really clever timing employed by everyone involved. If you sort of look back at the timeline of events, in March, South Korean President Yoon visited Tokyo, and the two leaders, announced that they were really restoring relations and resuming shuttle diplomacy. But even before that visit, it was announced that Yoon would be making a state visit in April to the United States, and so it was sort of, a bit of sleight of hand, in a way of communicating to the South Korean public, the relationship with the United States is very strong, and we're getting this state visit. And then he goes to Japan, and makes this big announcement. And then you had, I think it was May, was when Kishida, the Japanese prime minister, visited Seoul. And so you saw the sort of opening moves, I think, were really well orchestrated. Just a little bit of a preview. One of the articles in the upcoming magazine for the Diplomat covers sort of two competing trilaterals in Northeast Asia, the US, Japan, South Korea, and then the Japan, South Korea, China trilateral, which have sort of taken different trajectories. But one of the sort of core facets of that article is this remarking on this clever positioning, but also this sort of ebbs and flows of Yoon's popularity within South Korea. And I think South Korean presidents can only serve for one term, so he's not trying to sort of win himself a second term, because that's not possible. And so I think that freed Yoon up to do this kind of thing. Where that might sort of meet a brick wall is when South Korea does go to presidential elections. The pendulum could swing the other way domestic on the political scene in Korea, and that could kind of upset this institutionalization. So I think that's also one of the reasons why we see, I wouldn't say it's a rush, because I think you can't really rush these things, but you see these efforts to really nail down, as you just mentioned, the mechanisms of this trilateral cooperation. Because once you have sort of set up a bureaucracy and a system, it's hard to take that apart so easily. And so I think, especially if it proves useful. So I think certainly on the South Korean angle, that's some of the interesting politics. I'm curious what you think about sort of the impact of both Japanese politics and then the U.S. politics on this, because I think South Korea is often the one that's talked about as the one that could upset this relationship. But I think we should give sort of due course to both the United States and Japan and their ability to also upset this. It takes three to tango in this case.
Yeah, I mean, in the U.S., I think this has been one of those no-brainer good ideas, right? That promoting trilateralism is in U.S. interest. It has broadly bipartisan support. It's not a politically contentious issue. In Japan, Japan I think is very interesting because it cooperation with South Korea. So, as you noted, Yoon took the first step of taking the politically costly initiative to pursue cooperation with Japan. He was also operating at his popularity floor domestically, so he couldn't really get any more unpopular, right? So he, I think, expended that whatever political capital he had to try to communicate to Japan that a new government was in town and that the door was open for both bilateral cooperation and trilateral cooperation. In Japan, I think what's been interesting is Prime Minister Kishida. Obviously, he was very well positioned in the first 6 months of this year, not really facing any electoral challenges either at the Diet or in a general election. But really, I think it was the issue of managing internal Liberal Democratic Party politics, where the more hawkish, ultra-conservative wing of the LDP was rather mistrustful of South Korea more generally because of some of these domestic political problems in South Korea and sort of needing broader assurances from Seoul before the cooperation could proceed. So Kishida did, I think, take a little bit of a while. I think it took a few months before Japan was able to actually reciprocate some of South Korea's risk-taking. But in a way, it really doesn't matter now in hindsight, right? Because I think the moment we got to Camp David and then the articulation of some of the broader objectives and now the activation of this new missile warning system, which, as you noted, makes institutionalizes things, I think the expectation is that if this cooperation does begin to flag, it's probably going to be because of the U.S. or South Korea, right? I mean, the U.S., if President Trump returns, that could affect trilateralism. I mean, that wasn't something that, of course, the first Trump administration gave much attention to. But the other factor I want to note here is the external dimension of all this, right? I think historically we've seen trilateral cooperation increase. I mean, during the second term of the Obama administration, for instance, when Japan and South Korea finalized their GSOMIA agreement, which I think is another good example of the institutionalized cooperation, making it difficult for countries to renege on their commitments. And North Korea was making a rapid progress. That's been an accelerant, and that's certainly true, I think, in the current geopolitical environment. There's no diplomacy with North Korea. North Korean capabilities are quickly expanding, and so I think out of their own national security interests as well, Japan and South Korea are drawn towards cooperating trilaterally. But I think, Katie, that brings us to the last agenda item on our list, which I think does flow rather well. And you already alluded to President Yoon's state visit to the United States in April 2023. And this is the Washington Declaration that was announced during that state visit. Really interesting document. Quick update for our listeners on that. Basically a software upgrade to the U.S.-South Korea alliance, but also addressing implicitly U.S. concerns about the debate in South Korea about acquiring nuclear weapons. This came just a few months after President Yoon publicly mooted the possibility that South Korea could develop nuclear weapons as a policy option. And so the Washington Declaration takes a page out of the old Cold War playbook when the U.S. was worried about allied proliferation by countries like West Germany in the 1960s, and offers South Korea new forms of reassurance, including the creation of a new nuclear consultative group that just actually had a plenary meeting here in Washington in mid-December 2023, but also sets up a new commitment for President Biden to communicate with the South Korean president before any decision to use nuclear weapons is made, and potentially allowing the South Korean president to also make requests of the United States. And in exchange for all of these reassurances, the South Korean side offers its own reassurances to the United States that it will observe and hold to its nuclear nonproliferation commitments. And so there's been a lot of work in the months since to implement this, implement the nuclear consultative group. Separately, the U.S.-South Korea alliance has also adopted a new tailored deterrence strategy towards North Korea. So I think this is a pretty significant shift in the U.S.-South Korea alliance, and I think really one of the bigger ticket items for me thinking back on the year, Katie. But what are your thoughts on the Washington Declaration?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was a very strong signal on the strength of the alliance and sort of a reaffirmation of the commitments. And I think that that's a single signal not just to South Korea, but to the rest of Asia more broadly. Both sort of friend and foe alike can sort of observe this recommitment. And you see this kind of thing in several other aspects, I think, in U.S. Various alliances in Asia, and just sort of a recommitment of the promises already made. And because I think, and we've discussed this a lot, the common complaint about the United States in Asia is that the United States will get distracted by a crisis somewhere else, whether it's Europe or whether it's the Middle East, whether it was Afghanistan. And in so much as those criticisms were not true, it remains a thing people discuss. And so something like the Washington Declaration sort of pushes back on those sort of naysayers of the alliance about what the U.S. is committed to and what the U.S. is willing to do. Of course, I think we all hope we never get to the day where we have to find out, but it's been the lines have been drawn in the sand at least, so we shall see.
Absolutely. Well, I think that brings us to the end of 2023 on the Asia Geopolitics podcast. Katie, it's been a lot of fun this year talking through a lot of the issues we just talked about on this episode and the last one, but more broadly. So thanks a lot for continuing to co-host.
Yeah, absolutely. It is always a pleasure to talk to you, Ankit, about the geopolitics of Asia. Before I let you lead us out, I'm going to put in one more plug for the Diplomats magazine. Our January issue traditionally covers the cover story focuses on our outlook for Asia in 2024, in which we have 11 of our most favorite authors, including Ankit and myself, though we don't have to be your most favorite, laying out what we think that you should pay attention to in Asia. And so I would like to think of it as a preview, a what to expect for the coming year, and I encourage listeners to check it out. It'll be out around the new year.
That's right. Yeah, time to look forward. And on that note, I guess the last thing left to do is to wish all of our listeners a very happy new year and happy holidays more generally. And we'll look forward to seeing you back on the show in 2024. But as always, if you have suggestions for Katie and myself for what you'd like to see covered in the new year, do contact us. And don't forget to subscribe or leave us a review. We really do appreciate that. So with that, we'll close it out and we'll see you back in the new year.